Methodism has a reputation for being very activist. How does this connect with God's grace? Well, I first became a Methodist about 40 years ago, and I think the fact that I haven't been a Methodist all my life has coloured, obviously, the way that I think about Methodism, and right from the start made me ask questions: what's special about Methodism? And so I particularly remember something that the chapel steward in the village Methodist chapel, where I first joined the Methodist Church, said. He said, "Us Methodists are a restless lot." And so I've taken that as a sort of motto for thinking about Methodism, because I think that there's something really quite basic, not just about being very busy, but about a spirituality that's always asking, well, what more is there? What more has God got in store? Where does that come from? You could say it comes from John Wesley. You could say that he had a very driven personality and that he never really felt he was good enough and that he was always longing for more of God's grace. But just to derive it from the personality of John Wesley, however important we think he was as the founder of Methodism, and of course there are plenty of other people who were involved in the founding of Methodism as well, but however much we go back to John Wesley, I don't think that it can really explain why this forward-looking, activist spirituality has persisted. You could also say that it's something that's absolutely basic to Christians. You think about what St. Paul writes in his letter to the Philippians about the resurrection of Christ, and how in the Revised English Bible version it's rendered as, "Not that I have reached the goal, but I press on, hoping to take hold of that for which Christ first took hold of me." And that's just basic to Christian theology and spirituality. So is there a kind of spiritual restlessness and a need to be active in the church and the world, something that's special to Methodists? It's important not to exaggerate this, I think, particularly because in recent years, especially, evangelical Christians in general have turned to the world in a way that's asking the question, what's God doing in the world and how should we be joining in? So that kind of forward-looking restlessness isn't unique to Methodists. But is there something special? What might the connection be between an individual's growing in grace and the big wide world? Well, growing in grace can be a rather inward-looking concept. Maybe growing in grace and holiness, and that word holiness can be quite an uncomfortable word, like sanctifying, as we sometimes talk about, sanctifying grace, and it can set up the wrong vibes. But what it's about, growing in grace and holiness, obviously, is this basic model of discipleship that says that God always has more in store for us. Nicola Price-Tebbett quoted from the baptism service that the gifts of God's grace are there for us, even when we don't know anything about it, and that we can always, therefore, go on discovering more and more about this grace. In the communion services, the services for the ordinary Sundays, in each of those three services, the dismissal at the end of the service and the prayer that comes at the end has something to say about going on. It's a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. It's praying that we may grow in love. It's giving thanks for this food for our journey. Always looking for change and growth. But of course the question is, what sort of change and growth? Because basically holiness can go two ways. It can go in a very inner direction. It can go in a direction that's always asking, what's the state of my soul? Do I feel really close to God? Is my prayer life real and vibrant? basically, am I saved? And that became very characteristic of Methodism in John Wesley's lifetime through the 19th century, particularly because people were encouraged to keep a spiritual journal, and those were the sort of thoughts that they would very often be recording in that spiritual journal. A very inward-sounding spirituality as they reflected on what was going on in their class meetings and their prayer meetings. But they also took for granted an outward-looking spirituality. They also took for granted that as Methodists they would take part in Dorcas societies that provided clothes for the poor, in childbed linen societies that looked after women in childbirth and after, in strangers' friend societies that would welcome people who were new to the community and help them find their way around, give them good contacts, all sorts of practical help, which of course John Wesley characterised as works of mercy. The question is, though, why were they doing those works of mercy? What did they believe that God's grace was doing as they were doing those works? Well, they certainly believed that God's grace was at work in them. In John Wesley's sermon, The Scripture Way of Salvation, he tells believers that they should do works of mercy because it will be good for them. That you can't stay steadfast in your faith without doing good works, without being zealous of good works. In other words, what you do actually affects who you are. You grow in grace, not just by thinking holy thoughts, but by doing holy works. It links with a way of thinking about ethics, of thinking about what is it that enables a person to be a good person. That's really quite a recent development when we give it the label virtue ethics, and you may come across this at various stages as you follow this course. The idea that by living in a community which practices good ways of living, you yourself learn good ways of living, learn to be a better individual. So it really links up with what John Wesley taught about doing works of mercy. So right through the 19th century, you've got a strong emphasis on practical action alongside inner holiness. It just was what you had to do as a Methodist. And of course, it's also important for us to remember that there was a very strong conviction that you could actually fall away from your faith in God. It wasn't guaranteed to last for the rest of your lifetime. You could become what was known as a backslider and lose your faith. And therefore, to do good works was a way of keeping yourself strong and steadfast in your faith. Is what Christians do in the world just to do with them becoming better disciples? No. John Wesley was quite clear that the grace of God was at work in the whole world, outside the church as well as in it. That prevenient grace was very real and very important in his methodology of how the gospel spreads and what our part is in the spread of the gospel. Prevenient grace, he taught, extended to everyone, even if they'd never heard the good news of Jesus Christ. They weren't outside the grace of God. So what you get happening in Methodism is that towards the end of the 19th century, there's a much greater emphasis on organised social action and outreach. We associate it particularly with the city missions. The most famous of those, I suppose, is the West London mission, of which Hugh Price Hughes was the leader for many, many years. But there were plenty of other city missions as well. The whole thing described as the forward movement. It meant having a large central hall where you could have very large meetings and a lot of associated activities in a lot of other buildings and meeting rooms, and running a wide range of activities. I remember an architect working on a church redevelopment programme commenting that every time the Methodists started a new activity, they seemed to build a new hall to have it in. you may have come across church buildings that are like that. But the eventual aim of this activity, though, was to bring people to Christ. That's what it was all about, but it had to start with some very practical actions that would, if you like, bring them within reach of the gospel, because the understanding was that people by then, particularly living in the terrible slum conditions of late 19th, early 20th century industrial cities, were so far out of the reach of the gospel, even though God's grace was there for them. They had to be sort of brought along to a place where they could understand it better and feel it more directly. So you've got a great burgeoning of social activities, and particularly social activities that could bring people away from dependency on drink and what was politely described as immorality. By that time also, though, you've got secular organisations, although they were very full of people with religious and particularly Methodist backgrounds, but secular activities, things like trade unions and movements for health reform and social reform, that had the same sort of agenda for practical action to improve the quality of people's lives. And individual Methodists were very active there. Not so many leaders of Methodism saying this is part of our gospel outreach. Samuel Keble, who was very prominent in the trade union movement, was quite unusual as a Methodist minister to be involved in trade unionism in the early part of the 20th century. But all that activity was leading to the question, well, where is God before we actually get there with the explicit message of the gospel? But it seems to me that from the mid-1940s onwards, with the coming of the welfare state, an understanding of how God could be at work before the church was explicitly there with its message took on a new force, because with the coming of the welfare state, the basic idea of the Beveridge Report, which brought in the welfare state, was that there were giants at work in society, evil giants of poverty, unemployment, bad housing, bad health, ignorance, and that these giants were, if you like, sort of spiritual entities that needed to be slain. And once you start talking that sort of language, clearly you're talking about a place where the grace of God can be at work slaying the giants, even if no one is specifically saying it's God that's doing it. In other words, prevenient grace sort of comes into public discourse. You'll soon be reading an excerpt from a book by Kenneth Cracknell, which talks about structural sin, things that are built into the systems that we live in, which force people to live in ways which are actually sinful, although they've made no choice to be sinful. John Wesley's definition of sin was that you had to have chosen to do the sinful action. But in the world that we live in, where we're forced to live in ways that are unjust by the global trading system, where we're forced to live in ways that degrade the environment simply by the setup of the world in which we live, we have a different understanding of sin, and it makes a lot of sense, I think, to us to talk about structural sins, but therefore to see the grace of God at work also among those structural sins. And it's certainly the case that from the late 40s, 1950s onwards, you get church leaders much more prominent in what might be labelled as secular campaigns. For instance, Donald Soper, Lord Soper, in the disarmament movement, the Notting Hill group ministry that set up to provide social housing, and many similar involvements in such actions tackling structural sin. And of course there's the churches organising to end poverty on a global basis through organisations such as Tradecraft and relief organisations. So these social actions are carried out not so much with the aim of bringing Christ to the world, but of joining in with what God's already doing in the world to end social evils. God is already at work.